Do you like Terminators? I like Terminators. Tartaros not so much, but that is just me. However, there are other heresy era Terminators I totally love, and those are the Cataphractii. In my opinion, they look absolutely awesome and have a name that matches it. But from where do they have their name? Different nations have different ways to name their weapons, armor and vehicles. German tanks are named after white cats, many battleships have been called after cities or states, and sometimes we give a modern weapon a name of an old weapon, like how the US calls this weapon Javelin. And the Imperium of man is no different. The swords of the Ultramarines resemble those of Roman legionaries and thus are called Gladii. The Black Templars are named after a medieval order of Crusader knights, and giant machines manned by one man are called, well, knights. And the Cataphractii armor follows the same principle. The Cataphractii Terminators are named after the cataphracts of antiquity, and those cataphracts were heavy armored cavalry. They originated from Persia, even though the name cataphract itself comes from the ancient Greek word cataphractoi from the Diadochi era. The Persians were not the first ones to hand out armor to the rider and his steed, but they were the first ones to do it to a, let's say, greater extent. And yes, I see ancient Mesopotamian heavy cavalry as something different to cataphracts. Apologies to all ancient Assyrian viewers. Some of the Persian satraps also feared the cataphracts, but since it was very expensive to forge this much high-level armor, not every satrap had a lot of cataphracts. In my humble opinion, the cataphract is one of the most overlooked units in antiquity. Everybody knows about Roman legionaries, Greek hoplites, and maybe even Egyptian chariots, but Persian cataphracts are never in the spotlight. May it be as it is, those cataphracts fought the enemies of Persia, one of them being the Romans. And yes, I will largely ignore the Diadochi, just know that there were some Greek states who also had cataphracts, not a lot, but at least some. But going back to Rome, one of the greatest strengths of the Roman army was their adaptability. They copied the Celtic shields to make their scutums, copied Carthaginian warships, and also the cataphracts. So when you think of the Roman military, you probably think of legionaries in their classic lorica segmentata armor. However, as much as these men were the backbone of the Roman military, they were assisted by other units. Sometimes those were recruited Greeks or barbarians, like Germanic auxiliary cavalry, auxiliary archers from all corners of the Republic or Empire, and many different infantrymen. After the Romans had the opportunity to feel what it's like to face off heavy cavalry in the shape of Persian cataphracts, they copied that. The Romans had encountered Seleucid cataphracts, but it was the Parthians from Persia who were the first ones to make the Romans think that they needed heavy cavalry of their own, especially after the catastrophic Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC. We first hear of Roman cataphracts in the 1st century AD. It is possible that this was just another auxiliary unit and not made up of Roman citizens. The first time when the Romans truly, let's say, embraced cataphracts was under the reign of Emperor Hadrianus, and after the Sassanids came to power in Persia, the first large battles between Rome and Persia with hundreds of cataphracts on both sides occurred. But this does not mean that the Romans fielded thousands over thousands of cataphracts in every battle. They still were a select elite unit, since it takes years of training to become a good heavy cavalryman, and the amount of resources needed to equip and maintain those units was still enormous. Yes, Rome could afford it, but for the same amount of resources you could equip many more legionaries. So after the Roman Empire was split into two and the Western Empire fell, the Eastern Roman Empire still fielded cataphracts. I will call the medieval Eastern Roman Empire the Byzantine Empire from now on to make my life easier. Listen, if I say Greece instead of Hellas and China instead of Shwangur, then I might just call the medieval Eastern Roman Empire Byzantines. When we think of medieval cavalry, we often, if not always, think of Western knights. It is reasonable to think that the Byzantine cataphracts were the Eastern counterpart to Western knights, but there were differences. Knights were nobles. aristocrats who held a title. Byzantine cataphracts did not need to be a part of nobility. However, men of nobility in the Byzantine army were more likely to serve as heavy cavalry rather than being a foot soldier. Also, when we take a look at the armor of the Byzantine cataphracts, we see differences to Western knights. Whilst both units used chainmail, the cataphracts also had lamellar armor and scale armor, which were not used in the West, or at least not to such a large extent as in the East. Also remember that the Byzantine Empire fell before European soldiers were clad in more and more full-plate armor. Furthermore, remember that throughout the medieval ages, the steeds of Western knights often had no armor at all. This changed over time, but take a look at knights depicted in art from the high medieval period. This means that in the high medieval ages, cataphracts were the better armored but probably also slower unit, because all that armor weighs quite a bit. And I guess that is what inspired the Imperium or Games Workshop, since the cataphracts were a well and heavy armored but comparatively slow elite shock unit. And Cataphractii Terminators are well and heavy armored but comparatively slower elite space marines. It makes sense, doesn't it? Also, the Imperium is 100% the kind of empire who would use ancient human titles and names for their own things because of tradition and glory, etc. So there we have it. If you want to know more about cataphracts, I recommend looking up videos about the Byzantine army, and if you want to know more about the Terminators, there are probably dozens of lore channels who already covered the fanciest of Terminator units. I could, and maybe should, have talked more about the Byzantine cataphracts, but this is not a historical documentation and I better leave it to the people who know more on the topic than I do. Thanks so much for watching, and remember, the Emperor protects. Also, Cataphractii Terminators would be great in a Byzantine themed space marine army, don't you think?